Welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast, all about improving the lives of animals with better policies and practices in government and business. Brought to you by Animal Wellness Action, where we believe helping animals helps us all. Here's your host, Joseph Grove.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Joseph Grove. Our topic today is veganism, specifically the justifications for the way of life based on philosophical arguments for animals. And I have to tell you, this is an uncomfortable show for me. To be vulnerable, I've been dreading it.
Oh, no.
Not because of you, Matthew. Not because of you. Not because of our guest. It's because while part of me very badly wants to live a vegan lifestyle, another stronger part of me fights against it. The dietary changes, the complications that would be necessary to pull that off. And of course, the hypocrisy is especially egregious because I work in animal welfare. At most meals, I am disconcertingly aware of the paradox that I alternate between championing the cause for the better treatment of animals and advocating for compassion and kindness, and then benefiting from their slaughter and abuse. Some animal welfare organizations mandate their employees adhere to a vegan lifestyle. Animal Wellness Action, the sponsor of this show and my employer, is not such an organization. Its president, Wayne Pacelli, himself a vegan, understands the difficulty of extracting animals from our diet and believes a middle ground is that we can fight for animals to have only one bad day. That is, if we are going to consume animals' products and eat their meat, that everything possible should be done to ensure that those animals live as naturally and comfortably as long as possible. If you're like me in this ambiguity, this hypocrisy, knowing what we ought to do for animals, but not yet able to get there, perhaps we can both make some progress in this show together. With me to discuss the ethics and philosophy of veganism is Professor Matthew C. Halteman. Dr. Halteman is professor of philosophy at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics in the UK. He is the author of Compassionate Eating as Care of Creation and co-editor of Philosophy Comes to Dinner, Arguments about the Ethics of Eating. His new book, out just a couple of months ago, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, is a heartfelt, humane, and humorous exploration of how going vegan can bring abundance into our lives. So Matthew, I am so glad you're on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And I have to applaud as a philosopher, starting with that honesty and knowing yourself, right? That's day one in any philosophy class, is that we can't make any headway until we're honest about what the challenges and conflicts are. So what a daring and beautiful way to start our conversation, Joseph. Thank you.
For our listeners, I was talking to Matt before we started the show, and it said to him that if I could start my career over, I would go into philosophy and perhaps the academic route. A few years ago, I went through a major life transformation, Matt, and I can't remember from who said this, but I try to live my life under this maxim, that for the truth to stand before us, we can neither be for it nor against it. And then co-equally important, the first step on the path to truth is the assumption that everything is false. It has helped, and I don't know that I'm completely self-aware. I certainly try for that. But chief among these awarenesses is the fact that, man, if I were in front of this cow I am about to eat, I would probably come near to tears at the thought of his or her being killed. But yet I persist in doing what I know I ought not or don't want to do. What the heck's wrong with me, Matt? What's wrong with me?
There are some vegans who will probably put me on the blacklist for saying this, but I think actually nothing is wrong with you. I think this is absolutely the way we human beings are built. And one of the main things I try to do in Hungry, Beautiful Animals is to honor the fact that we human beings, Joseph, we are plural minds, right? And what I mean by this is we are not of a piece in this complex inner family that we have, right? I mean, and I love the way you described it. You even used the language that I'm inclined to use myself of parts, right? You said there's a part of me that wants compassion to rule the day. And then there's another part of me, right, that wants what I'm about to enjoy as I've always enjoyed it at Thanksgiving or at Christmas or on my birthday or whatever it is. And I think that is how we're built, right? I mean, we've all had this experience of feeling tensions among our physical, emotional, social, intellectual, and moral parts, if you will, right? So we've all had this experience where our heart wants to nuzzle the cow, right? But our gut wants that juicy burger, right? And then our head is sort of bobbling about back and forth between trying to find intellectual justifications for the status quo and trying to get up the gumption to have a bit more self-respect and maybe push beyond the status quo. And then our moral self is sort of standing off to the side, shaking its head, right? And shame and blame is kind of the way things feel often in our inner family, because instead of having harmony across these different parts of who we are, we feel these fundamental conflicts. And I think that's absolutely expectable given how complex we are. And actually, Joseph, I think a big problem with our movement to this point, and I should say, I think the movement has done amazing things. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. I always see criticism as a gift rather than a rejection. But when I have to think about what our movement could do better, which I think we all need to think harder about, we act as though we're sort of brains on a stick, right? That if we just bring the intellectual arguments with as much rigor as possible, we'll know exactly what to do and we'll do it. Or if we just flood people's emotions with these horrific videos, right? Then once and for all, everyone will change. And I think we know from 50 years of trying these methods, we've got about the same number, right? Of people who have decided radically to change their diet, 1 to 2% or whatever. And I think a big part of the problem is we haven't honored the degree to which we are plural-minded in our experiences. And so I think a big part of the way forward for the movement for animal freedom and compassion is to recognize that we need different starting points for different people when it comes to offering folks the chance to see these changes as an opportunity to be consistent with who we've always been, rather than a kind of obligation that shames and blames us, right, into doing things differently. And that's a bit of a trick because I think the vast majority of us are just like you, right? I certainly was, where I knew that I should be doing differently, but for whatever reason, I simply couldn't find the gumption, right?
Yeah.
To get those different parts of my inner self to agree.
I want to talk about the starting points you mentioned. When I find myself motivated to lose weight, and I've been overweight all my life, and I've had some success at times, but when I find myself motivated, it's not when I think about the health benefits. It's not when I think about perhaps being shamed. And of course, there's much less fat shaming nowadays than when I was growing up in the 70s. Of course, you were certainly the object of bullying back then if you were overweight. But and again, this is something I'm not happy to admit, but it's looking at other fat people and not wanting to be like them. So we can see ourselves maybe as drawn toward a positive, or perhaps confronted by shame. But then there's also an aversion to being part of a crowd that maybe adheres to a set of values we find objectionable. And I wonder what you think in the panoply of ethical possibilities drives people most. Is it shame? Is it wanting to do better? Or is it wanting to not do worse or do bad, right? Is it positive, neutral, or negative in the landscape of things?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm not a social scientist. I'm a philosopher. So for social scientists, maybe some of the things I'm about to say will feel a little too armchair. I'd like to think that they also cohere with, the latest evidence we have in the social sciences. But I'm inclined to think that the answer is different for different people, right? I mean, we've all had this experience. Some of us are motivated by really radical intellectual arguments. We see them once, they capture our imagination, we're really interested, right? Others of us need to know that the most delicious tiramisu in the world is still possible vegan before we can open our minds to the facts of the matter, or open our hearts, right, to the fact that other sentient creatures feel and desire and etc. Some of us need social safety nets, right? We need to understand going in that we can have a half decent Thanksgiving without being mocked out the door by our own parents or siblings, right? Before our head or our heart are able to take some of these things on board. So I think different people have different inner makeups. And for that reason, we need, as the theorist of change and advocacy consultant Adrienne Marie Brown says, we need many, many feet on many, many different paths, because transformation has its own messy beauty, right? We're never going to find a silver bullet, because human beings, right, from person to person, have different configurations of desire and need and agency and what, helps them with motivation. Now, I do think one thing that we see from people across the board, and this is where I'm inclined to start, when we desire something, Joseph, it doesn't take any willpower to do it, right? And so I want you to think for a second about the difference between, right, you're on your couch, you've got a nice blanket over you, you're watching some Netflix, and the thought occurs to you, I've got to clean the bathroom. Well, right, this is going to be a disaster. Everybody knows you're going to stay on the couch, right? Unless your in-laws are coming, there's no way you're getting up to clean that bathroom, because it would take willpower to do that. But now suppose you're on that couch and you remember that some leftover tiramisu is up there in the fridge and everybody else in the house is asleep, right? Desire is going to get you up off that couch the second you have that thought, right? And it's sort of like those old Woody Woodpecker cartoons where the smell of the delicious food, right, wafts across the room, enters your nostril, and sort of compels you along. And so I think for all of us, regardless of what our inner family configurations are like physically, intellectually, emotionally, socially, morally, we all respond to desire in very much the same way. We find it motivating. When we want something, we're drawn to it. And so I think the $1 million question for the movement for animal freedom and compassion is to know our audiences well enough to know, what do they desire? On what vision do they feed their imagination? What are the things that they really, really want? What are their deepest desires? And then, right, we find a way to tell the story of the world we want to live in ways that will trigger desire rather than shame or blame or a sense of burdensome obligation.
I do have, and I'm using myself as a stand-in for maybe others in the audience, I do have that desire, but it's not sufficient to overcome the objections. So how do I get to that tipping point where my desire exceeds the anti-desire?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think, again, and no one will be surprised to hear a philosopher take it back to Socrates, but I think that's where the know yourself piece really comes into play, right? The deeper a relationship we have with those different parts of our inner family, the more we learn about those different parts and how they affect our agency and motivation, the more power we're going to have to leverage the right kind of desire to move us in the right direction. So for instance, let's suppose that, in an ordinary person, I mean, if there is such a thing, we're all pretty weird at the end of the day, but, let's take the so-called average person from armchair philosophy hypotheticals here. You're sitting there and you have a desire to do better. Absolutely. Like you've just said, Joseph, you know that you should be moving in a direction faster, right, than you're currently moving there. Intellectually, you know that. But emotionally, you've grown up eating these foods that you love and they provide a lot of comfort. And socially, you can't really imagine, right, eating foods that are going to make you stand out. And physically, maybe you even have cravings or desires that it doesn't matter how intellectually or morally convicted you are. Your gut biome is going to lead you to the Doritos, right? Regardless of what your intellectual and moral commitments may be. So that's where I think that inner knowledge, right? If you learn about yourself, okay, I am really driven by my emotional commitments to food. Like I realize that I will never be a vegan as long as I can't imagine a beautiful vegan Thanksgiving. Or I will never be a vegan until there's the perfect Sunday brunch with my best friends. Or I will never be a vegan until I can become an ultra marathoner on a plant-powered diet, right? Do that inner, I think of it sometimes as, I don't often, pivot into corporate lingo, Joseph, but when I do, I think the SWOT analysis is a really helpful way to think about our inner lives, right? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What opportunities does that unique constellation of strengths and weaknesses present to us? And what threats are there on account of that unique combination of strengths and weaknesses? What self-understanding can do for us is to help us to learn, okay, where are my food struggles rooted? And what remedies might I look for to address those? Right. So for a person, for instance, who, worries, well, I grew up a Christian. And it seems like, whenever I go to church, people look at me askance because I care about animals. As long as that's the case, I'm not going to be able to do this. Well, then pick up David Clough's 2-volume series, right? And get that intellectual bulwark. And we could do this across the board if we had a longer time, right? Zeroing in on where those strengths and weaknesses are, what threats they present, what opportunities they present. And of course, right, in a way, this is disappointing because we all want a silver bullet. Being told to do the hard work of self-introspection may not be the answer, right, that people are looking for. But I think once you get the courage to do that inward-facing turn and get down to the business of that work, you realize, oh, wow, there are all sorts of interesting hacks that I can use to avoid falling into the same pitfalls, right, that recurrently pit these different parts of myself against one another so that I'm not able to make any progress. And I know we talked off the air about how much you love the Stoic tradition, right? And me too, heavily influenced by the Stoic tradition. So I like to think of this inner work and the exercises we find, right, in order to do that inner work in the way that Marcus Aurelius does, right? These are spiritual exercises where we understand spiritual in this much broader sense, right? Not necessarily religious, but looking for a way to harmonize the physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and moral aspects of who we are in a way that is aimed at deep flourishing, right? At the maximizing the fulfillment of these different capabilities we have to be well. So introspection plus spiritual exercises takes a little work, but the truth and beauty and goodness that you will feel once you find the courage to start, I think will be enough to keep a lot of people moving forward.
I like what you said about writing it down. There's a Joan Didion, I'm going to paraphrase, she said, I don't write what I think. In essence, I write to know what I think. And there is something about the exercising of thought through the hand onto paper that is so revelatory in terms of introspection, even that I think I'm going to, as a takeaway from my conversation with you, apply that to write down what exactly is it that is stopping me from doing it. And I have a vague sense, you alluded to one of them, and that is the peer pressure, let's say, right? The standing out. Long before I got into animal welfare, I traveled to Las Vegas with a colleague on a business trip. He was a vegan, and by the end of that trip, I detested this man because every meal we went to have, we had to worry about what they had on the menu. And no, I can't go there because they don't have this. And I really couldn't, I love the guy, but I couldn't stand him at the time because it was such a nuisance. And I know that I risk becoming a burden to my poor wife, who already, struggles to feed us and our 7-year-old. So there's that. And then it's not so much that, and maybe this is true for others, right? It's not so much that I love steak, that I think my life would be meaningfully less if I never had another burger. It's that I need to overcome the objections to the food that exists as an alternative to that and which are healthful. I briefly went vegetarian for a while, but really I was more of a pastatarian. I gained so much weight because I didn't really care for the healthy foods. And by going back to the carnivorism, I actually lost weight. So I think even your SWOT, the strengths, well, I think those who listen to the show care about animals, and certainly that's a strength because that's a perspective not everyone has, and we can talk about that too in a little bit. But the weakness I have is an aversion to healthy foods. Never have liked my fruits and vegetables. Opportunities, we could certainly cite the growing number of options, even when it comes to, like impossible meat, and that may not have health benefits as we understand it, but it certainly is an alternative to eating animals. And then the threats for me would be, my wife just says, well, you're on your own, bucko, good luck. So I like that. You talked about starting points a minute ago. How do you see the spectrum of where people begin this journey?
Yeah, such a good question, Joseph. And I think, one of the parts of the book, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, that I'm most excited about is a pivot from what I think of as veganism, right? Which is this sort of rigid, rule-based, identity-focused way of thinking about what it means to be a vegan, right? And the idea is you become a vegan through the perfect abstention from animal products. What it means to be a vegan is to hold this identity that you've earned by perfectly fulfilling your obligation, right, to other creatures by not participating in any way in their harm. That vision, right, which often has the ism attached to it, I think is a really problematic way to think about these things, right? Because in no other area where human beings, right, aspire to something beautiful, do we apply that ridiculously rigid standard. I mean, imagine, for instance, if a Buddhist, right, suppose you're waiting in the bushes outside of a Buddhist temple and you follow a Buddhist to their car. And when the Buddhist notices that a bird has taken a dump on their windshield and they get visibly angry about this, you pop up out of the bushes and say, you got angry. Clearly, you're too attached to material possessions. Guess you're not a Buddhist after all, right? This is ridiculous, right? This is not what we mean by aspiring to a Buddhist vision. Similarly, with a Christian, right? I've never heard anybody think that they cease to be a Christian because they hate their ideological enemies at a particular moment, right? No, we aspire to this beautiful vision that we know in advance we're not going to be able to instantiate perfectly. We're going to be on a journey, right? Our imagination has been captured. We're going to need to do that SWOT analysis, find some spiritual exercises, the repetitive use of which will hopefully push us incrementally in the direction of realizing that aspiration. But this idea that there's such a thing from an identitarian perspective as a person who has completely taken themselves out of the harm economy, I think we need to move past that and move to a more aspirational vision. So, Joseph, my view is, right, that we should think about the V word in terms of going vegan, right? And what it means to be going vegan is to say this vision of a world where we're all doing the best we can to foment as much space for creaturely flourishing as we possibly can, right? That is the vegan vision. And then each and every one of us has to do that SWOT analysis to figure out how they are going to take steps in that direction. And it sounds to me, Joseph, like you've been going vegan for years, right? You are not a vegan in the identitarian sense, but I would argue that very few, if any, people are, right? And the way to think about this instead is the question of whether one is an aspiring vegan depends on their outlook on and their desire for fomenting creaturely flourishing. And then they find daily practices to move in that direction. So I would say for starting points, right? That was a lot of wind up, but I think it's required because I really want people to have this distinction between veganism, which is an identity, and going vegan, which is a trial and error based journey, right? That's going to be different for every person based on the complexities of their inner family, as I often call it.
Having some, familiarity with 12-step programs, one of the mantras is, progress, not perfection. I think many of us are into this black and white, all or nothing approach where we do say, well, if I can't do it 100%, that means I'm not doing it at all. So I like what you say there, that it is not the destination of perfection, but rather the journey, which may never be completed, toward that aspirational perfection. I like that. And then it also calls to mind that, if I were to say, for example, let's say a recovering alcoholic were to say, I'm never going to have a drink the rest of my life, then that would almost present an insurmountable psychological chip on the shoulder where that part of you would say, I'll show you. And that's where this one day at a time kind of thinking also translates, I think, to going vegan. And that is, well, I can't say that I'm going to do this the rest of my life. It may be insurmountable, but I can do it today. Or yes. I can even do it this meal or this visit to a restaurant.
Absolutely. And I think that's the starting point, right? What each person does is they figure out, okay, I love this vision. I am motivated by this vision that every sentient creature who can feel and experience the beauty of social interaction and be challenged by a world pushing back to try to do well, every creature that has that opportunity is one with whom I want to be allied. Now, what does my little patch of soil look like? Let's start with my inner soil, right? What is my inner family like? What's that SWOT analysis? But then what are things like in my yard? What are things like at my job, right? And then you identify repetitive daily practices that will discipline your imagination daily to that desire to move toward, right? This vision of creaturely flourishing that you want to be a part of. And I think what's really important to notice here is that it's a pivot away from the movement's obsession with showing people suffering, right? Toward a movement that shows people the vision of creaturely flourishing that we all find motivating, right? And that's not to say that we shouldn't pay attention to the extreme forms of suffering that are happening, but instead we should recognize that our concern about suffering arises first and foremost from our desire to experience and be a part of creaturely flourishing. And I think sometimes that really important starting point gets lost. Going vegan is not about being against suffering. Going vegan is about being for flourishing. And because we're for flourishing, it doesn't make sense to contribute to systems that cause so much suffering, right? But we're for flourishing, and anti-suffering is sort of, right, secondary to being for flourishing. And so the starting points then would be, I think, know yourself and start small, right? And I love the way you framed it, right? It is think in terms of hours or even minutes rather than days, weeks, and months, right? Because at any given moment, there are ways that you can live into this vision. And I think no moment is too small, right? Seeing a spider in the corner of your home, and instead of deciding you need to squash it, deciding instead that you want to let it be, right? noticing that squirrels and rabbits are going in and out of your yard because there's a little hole in your fence. Well, leave that there. And then maybe they have a chance at escaping aerial predators, right? There are all these tiny little ways that can push us over time if we carve these neural grooves into our brains, right, through repetition, that will keep us focused on the creaturely flourishing we desire. And in my experience, what happens as we work at this is that the desire to foment and leave space for creaturely flourishing gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And things that we used to struggle with get increasingly easy. But the trick is to move in this direction without making radical changes, right, to who you are. You start close to home. And,
Right.
one of the things I say to my students all the time is, right, there's really nothing radical about going vegan. When you read Charlotte's Web for the first time at age 5, if you were cheering for Wilbur and Charlotte rather than hoping that Wilbur would become a pork chop and Charlotte would get squashed, you're going vegan, right? This is kindergarten ethics. There are no beliefs or experiences or ideas that the average person doesn't already have that you need, right? And I think, and it's really important to remember, the vast majority of us are vegans in waiting, because a lot of times what we figure out as we move toward this trajectory is that we actually have to change precisely in order to stay the same, right? We have to move in the direction of doing better in order to become the humane, compassionate, loving people we thought we already were, right? Before we had a chance to connect these dots in ways that our culture makes it very difficult to do.
Yeah, having enough religion to make you miserable, right? Which is what a lot of preachers, talk about from the pulpit. That folks believe just enough that they become unhappy, and it's just fully committing.
You're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsor.
This is Wayne Pacelli with Animal Wellness Action. We depend on countless people like you to support our fight for animals. Join us today by donating to further our campaigns to spare countless animals from cruel and needless pharmaceutical tests. Put an end to animal fighting. Liberate farm animals from extreme confinement, and so many others. Become a donor at any amount. Visit animalwellnessaction.org/donate to join our fight against animal cruelty of all kinds. That's animalwellnessaction.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the Animal Wellness Podcast.
I like what you said too about not looking at the negatives, but focusing on the positives. And it's a very, very simple way of saying what you said, but that is, don't look at it in terms of the suffering that your carnivorism supports, but look at focusing on the better, on supporting that more kind, humane way of living. My words there, not yours. It reminds me that I'm thinking of E.E. Cummings up for a couple of reasons here. When he was a soldier in World War I, or when that was going on, he was criticized a lot because he wouldn't join in the anti-German rhetoric. And he said, I don't want to say I hate the Germans. He said, I like the French. Right. So maybe what we can say is, it's not that we, of course we do. It's not that we don't want to do these things. It's we do want to do this thing. And that is to leaven this desire for flourishing throughout all of our activities. And maybe that's a less scolding way to do it. The teacher's maxim, it's easier to catch them being good. It's easier to praise into virtue than to pound out of vice. So I like that as another takeaway. My interest in animals began with an E.E. Cummings poem, a very simple one, very famous one. Me up it does out of the floor, quietly stare a poisoned mouse, still who alive is asking, what have I done that you wouldn't have? And that really, at an early age, set me on this journey of understanding that really they're doing nothing that I don't do. I try to live. I try to, build a family, et cetera, et cetera. And Bertham's quote, It's not can they reason or can they speak, it's can they suffer, that great commonality we have. As you look across the various arguments to support this kind of flourishing lifestyle, Matt, what are for you the most powerful? Which ones do you really focus on in your book and believe most powerful in potential?
Yeah, such a good question. And my answer is complicated because actually this book represents to some extent a pivot away from sort of isolated theoretical arguments and toward a more aesthetic approach, where instead of trying to convince anyone of anything, I'm really trying to woo the audience, right, into seeing this as a more truthful and beautiful and good way of life that they really already at a fairly deep level desire to have for themselves, for their family, for the world at large, for other creatures. And so I think arguments are very, very important. But in my experience, arguments usually function in a kind of post hoc sort of way, right? It's like we start looking for arguments when our hearts have changed and we need a bulwark against criticism from others, right? Very few people I know, see the argument and change, right? And so that is why I typically in my advocacy work, and even really in my philosophical work in the classroom, I know that if I want people to be ready to learn, what they need to have is this fascinating combination of comfort and curiosity. And that is achieved, in my experience, much more so with exciting, beautiful narrative ways in, right? Good stories, than with argumentative ways in that sort of presume that, okay, it's the cognitive leverage that is going to rule the day here. And if the cognitive leverage doesn't work for you, then you're too emotional or too socially enslaved or too much a slave to your body, or, right? I mean, there's this, and I think philosophers traditionally, part of the reason we don't have the ears, right, of the general public as often as maybe we'd like to, is because we've been very insensitive to that complexity of our plural-mindedness. We think, well, to start with stories or to start with myths or to start with meta-narratives, well, that's what, weak people need. What we really need is pure rationality and just to sort of see the truth, right? And then we'll all sort of move in the right direction. And I think what we've seen over the past 50 years, since Peter Singer's amazing and incredibly influential book, Animal Liberation, a book that I assign in all my classes that I've profited tremendously from reading. But if you're not a moral hero, you're probably not going to read, right, Animal Liberation and put the really compelling cognitive pieces of the puzzle together and then change your life, right? Now, people on the tip of the moral spear, they're going to read Animal Liberation and change things. But the early adopters, the people in the middle, right, who need to see the culture moving in that direction before they'll find the courage to move that way themselves, right? Arguments are not the primary mover, right, for most people. And so what I'm trying to do in Hungry Beautiful Animals is I say, look, the arguments are all there. And this is one of the things, actually, Joseph, that I find incredible as a professional philosopher. I mean, if you wanted to go in philosophy, you probably remember this well. Philosophers don't agree about anything, right? Like, we can't even agree whether middle-sized dry objects exist, right? Some of us admit tables and chairs into our ontology. Others of us believe that, no, it's particles arranged table and chair wise, right? We don't agree about anything. So the fact that the literature on the question of whether our current food system is defensible is practically settled is just bizarre, right? Like, you cannot find anyone, right, who is taken seriously in the wider ethical literature who's saying, you know what, factory farming, we should stick with it. I mean, there are a couple of people who have tried, but they're usually shown the door fairly quickly by the people, who who have really done the work. And so I don't care whether you're interested in consequentialist arguments or deontological arguments or virtue-based arguments or capabilities-focused arguments. I mean, take your pick. You will find a really solid argument for thinking that our current food system is morally indefensible, no matter who you're reading. So that's a beautiful thing, but I think it's a beautiful thing for that small percentage of the general public who take arguments seriously and are moved by them. And so the reason that in Hungry Beautiful Animals, I'm focusing more on the aesthetic project of helping people find their innate desire for this beautiful world that going vegan has to offer us is kind of the way I'm going about persuading here. It's a very different sort of thing than trying to convince anybody of something, right, through intellectual leverage. What I'm doing instead is to say, here are the stories of my journey into finding that I had incredibly deep desires to shape my life in accordance with this vision of a world of creaturely flourishing that until I was 30 years old, I had no sense, right, that those desires were there, and yet they were. And in the wake of kindling them and finding them, my life has been changed for the better in almost every respect I can think of: physically, emotionally, socially, intellectually, and morally. So all the arguments are there for the people who are motivated, and I can happily send you an email for the show notes and go right down the list of theoretical, moral perspectives and give you the arguments. I think, frankly, virtually every major ethical theory offers an excellent argument, gives us excellent reasons to go vegan. But really for this book, because so many excellent books about arguments already exist, right? I'm focusing here on that kind of aesthetic project of helping people to see that this is what we all desire if we actually do that inner work.
We have evolved, I think, faster in our ability to create arguments than we have in our ability to be inspired by them. We do seem very much to be a storytelling creature, an animal that responds to narratives, to that kind of inspiration. And that's a perspective that we've not yet completely cracked the code on in our own work. So for example, a year ago, there was a guy out in Wyoming who ran over a young female wolf with his snowmobile, duct taped her mouth shut, took her to a bar to torment her, and then eventually took her out back of the bar and shot her. And that was such a powerful story that we received more response than we would have times 100 than if we had merely said, there are people who will run down wolves with snowmobiles and hurt them and torment them, and we need to criminalize the use of snowmobiles. So again, I'm liking very much what you're saying, and that is that I think the key, even for me, some for our audience, is just to find a way to have that narrative, that story, and to be able to visualize, even in the case perhaps of specific animals, what life could be like for us. And maybe that I want to go into another part of it, because I do think that a lot of disregard for animals in the West comes from the Judeo-Christian heritage, right, where we have God saying you have dominion over all animals. And of course, there are numerous examples in what most would call the Old Testament or the New Testament of God actually arguing for mercy and kindness for animals. But we seem to glom on to this notion that they were put here for our use. And this whole concept of ensoulment, where we have the breath of God and they don't, makes them less than and therefore okay to mistreat for our purposes. What say you to all of that?
Yeah. So the first thing I always point out is I think it's really important to make careful distinctions. Oftentimes we talk about things like the Judeo-Christian tradition as if it weren't already hundreds of traditions, right? There are so many different ways to think about what the Judeo-Christian tradition is. And that's why there are Catholics and Orthodox and Coptic Christians and Protestants of hundreds of varieties. And right, so the Judeo-Christian tradition is always already traditions. So that's the important thing I want to say, which leads to the second point, which I think we also lose track of. Our preferred interpretations of some of these traditions reflect our own inherent biases, right? The cultural proclivities of our times, the self-serving ways, right, that we've set up to continue forms of oppression that benefit the people who are powerful. And so rather than blame the Judeo-Christian traditions, what I'd prefer to do is say, well, let's start in humility with ourselves, right? Perhaps we've been poor interpreters, right, of what these texts have to offer. And the way to think about what these traditions have to offer is to look at what the very best, most cutting edge theologians across a variety of different traditions have to say about what these texts, in fact, are saying, right? And I think when you do that work, it turns out that at least the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the one, I'm most familiar with myself, the bookends of the Judeo-Christian vision are a veganic paradise in Eden, right? Where the very first dignity bestowed upon human beings by God, right, in this creation narrative, is the naming of fellow creatures who, by the way, are initially envisioned as companions for human beings, right? Moreover, the dominion command is offered in an explicitly vegan context, just one verse after we're told to eat plants, right? In Genesis 1:28 and 1:29. So that is, in the beginning. And then when God's redemptive work is finished, right, Isaiah's holy mountain, we see this mythos, right, of the lion laying down with the lamb and the child playing in the asp's den. In other words, predation and animosity among the species will be resolved into the justice and joy of shalom, right? All species kinship. Those are the bookends of the Judeo-Christian vision. And meat eating doesn't even come into it until the Noachic covenant, where as a concession to sin, God reluctantly says, I gave you shalom and you blew it. So now, right, using this military metaphor, the animals are delivered into I gave you shalom. You were supposed to be their companions and their caretakers. You blew it. Well, now there's animosity between you. So in the Hebrew, right, this is much more like the language of disdain, right? Than like, fire up the barbecue. It's finally time, right? So I think, really careful attention to what these texts actually say. I think this is equally true for the Christian texts, right? The Pauline epistles and the Gospels. When you look at what the trends are there, the trends are to look for the fruit of the Spirit in our everyday life, right? So what makes us more patient? What makes us more kind? What makes us more loving? What makes us more faithful to this calling to foment creaturely flourishing? Well, good grief. Do you see any of the fruit of the Spirit in contemporary industrial animal agriculture? I can't think of a system more bereft, right, of those qualities than the system that we currently use to feed ourselves. And I think that that's true. I can only speak from personal experience and expertise from within the religion that I'm a part of, right? I'm a Christ follower, and the Judeo-Christian vision is, right, that vision of shalom, justice, and joy for all God's creatures is sort of the vision that I inherited, and the one I'm still, with deep humility and often very confused, right? Trying to work toward, often skeptical too, depending on what other Christians around me are saying that I find incomprehensible or silly, right? It's a very, very complex thing to try to, live into visions that are this complicated and this contested. But what I've learned, as a scholar of these issues over the years is that, practitioners of other faith traditions find something very similar, that what they've learned their tradition says about other creatures and our duties and opportunities with respect to them, and what these texts actually say when they're read in the spirit of the whole theological or spiritual arc of the tradition, are very, very different, right? That most of the world religions are vastly more animal friendly than the inherited versions of them that we're currently practicing would lead us to believe. And, Joseph's selfishness, I think, and a lack of humility and self-serving interpretation, right, explain why we zero in on the parts of the tradition that seem to license, right, these really selfish and frankly self-defeating behaviors. I mean, our current food system is not only selfish, it's, from the standpoint of egoism, completely insane. Like if we really want to do well, we wouldn't need an altruistic bone in our body to want to completely redo this system, because it's killing us as individuals, right? And we'll be bereft of a place to live if we can't find our way, right, to more humility and wisdom in the way that we're feeding ourselves. So I'm inclined to think, right, the more careful attention we pay to our spiritual and religious traditions, the more beautiful opportunities we'll find for resonance with this vision of going vegan. There are many, many excellent resources throughout the world's spiritual traditions for motivating us to move in that direction. And so my advice to people is, don't believe the hype. Don't fall for soundbite religion. When you do the deep work, you will find the resonance.
Matthew, fascinating conversation. I really do appreciate it. We're getting close to our time. What have I not asked you about your thinking, your latest book that you would like to make sure we address?
Well, you've been very generous, and we've actually hit the vast majority of things that I'd be inclined to talk about. And of course, your audience much better than I do. So I trust you that we hit the things that they'll be concerned and excited to learn about. I will tell people where they can find out more if they're curious. The title is weird enough that we were able actually to get the .com. It was still available. So people can find out more at hungrybeautifulanimals.com. And we have a whole bunch of resources there. Of course, there are links to order the book at whatever bookseller you may choose. I'll mention as well that I am the narrator of the audiobook. So if you like this podcast and you can stand the, living hell of listening to me for 7 hours and 9 minutes, right, then that might be a fun way to learn more about what's going on in the book. But yeah, hungrybeautifulanimals.com. And I absolutely love to hear from people. So if people have questions, one of my favorite things to do, Joseph, is I'm a teacher first and foremost. So helping students devise plans for how they are going to move toward this vision in the really down, dirty, nitty gritty of their personal lives, right? Like, what are the specific exercises that they can use to move in this direction that are custom for them? Some people like to make custom cars. I like to make custom spiritual disciplinary regimes, right? And so if readers are interested in exploring those things, I'm just an email away, and I love to help people, right, to think those things through. So hungrybeautifulanimals.com. Hope to see you in cyberspace.
Thank you for listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and follow Animal Wellness Action on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. To stay current with all of our news and information and to take action to help animals, sign up at animalwellnessaction.org. Until next time, remember, helping animals helps us all.